If you're even kind of into comic books, there's a good chance that you've seen this picture floating around. This is a new Batman. It's called Absolute Batman. It's part of a new story line that DC is starting. It's not a reboot, it's just a separate universe. So think like Marvel's Ultimate Comics, but DC. And all of this is coming from an event called Absolute Power. Now, I'm a huge fan of DC as a whole, but specifically the Super Fam and the Bat Fam. But more specifically, I am a huge fan of John Kent. He is my favorite character in all of comics, which I know is not a common thing to hear. Well, I'm finally starting to read Absolute Power as someone with a deep love and extensive knowledge on the lore of Superman. Shit's getting weird. So I wanted to kind of go through Absolute Power. I'm going to start by just kind of what it is and a little bit about the story. There's going to be spoilers, obviously, but I'm going to try to keep them as light as possible and speak as generally as possible to avoid spoiling as many details as I can. But the main point I'm wanting to get to with this is to explain why this story is setting itself up to be kind of a big deal and why it reflects one of the most influential storylines of all time for comics. So this is a storyline, like a lot of storylines in comics, that has kind of been brewing for several years. A lot of this comes as a consequence to the events of Son of Kal-El, which is John Kent's solo title, to the point where not only does he have his own one-shot in this event, but also a lot of the story, especially the prologue of the story, centers around a character called Dreamer. Dreamer was first introduced in a CW show, I believe it was Supergirl, but she debuted in the comics after that, in Son of Kal-El number 13. And this is kind of a separate fun fact. She is mostly being written by Nicole Maines, who is the actress who played her in the CW. So basically, she helps Amanda Waller get her plan together because she's forced to. Amanda Waller is kind of using the nation of Gomorrah as like her super prison. Gomorrah is the country that was pretty much the entire plot of Son of Kal-El. They basically freed Gomorrah from this evil dictatorship, and now there's this power vacuum, which is what Amanda Waller is taking advantage of in order to succeed. And she does succeed. Another thing that's been kind of setting up over the past year or two is Lex Luthor is once again in jail, and he is once again doing the thing where he tries to convince Superman, no, I'm a changed person, trying to make everyone believe that he really is changed, he cares about fighting for good. And one big way that he tries to show this is when he went to jail, he needed something to do with his company, LexCorp. So he rebranded it, named it Supercorp, and now it belongs to Superman. Well, at one point in Absolute Power, Lex Luthor's mother basically becomes this like terroristic threat on Supercorp, and Lex finally proves himself to Superman by basically sacrificing himself to save the day and to save Superman and everyone else. So Superman, Clark, is giving this speech about how I was wrong about you, you really do care, you're a changed person, spilling his guts about how proud he is of Lex. To which Lex responds, who is Lex? And this is a thing that is going to keep happening in this story. People are going to be losing their memories. This is because Amanda Waller, the way that she's found to succeed is she has found a way to not only take people's powers or unique gifts, such as intelligence, not only can she take those from those people, she can now harness them. She can give them to her people, so now her people have those powers. And a side effect of this, though it doesn't happen to every hero, is when they get their powers or their gifts taken, they completely lose all of their memories. They have no idea who even they are. So Lex Luthor is essentially a blank slate at this point, and where there's character development for Lex, there's often character development for Mercy, not far behind. Mercy being Lex Luthor's longtime assistant. She's usually portrayed as like cruel, evil, cold, because she's Lex Luthor's assistant, so that tracks. There's this one part in the story where she is literally crying in Superman's arms. She is so devastated by recent events. A really touching moment, honestly. I've always liked Mercy, even though she's the devil from the Bible. You know, she's like evil Lois Lane, but not quite as cool. And speaking of Lois Lane, we obviously get a badass moment from her fairly early on in the story. The heroes are hiding out, and Amanda Waller's team finds them. It's kind of a all hope is lost moment until someone is basically like, y'all need to get out of here and armor up. And it's some lady in this incredible war suit, and that some lady is Lois. And I just love Lois Lane so much. She can have badass moments like that, but then also have these really sweet moments. Like one of my favorite Lois moments ever was in Son of Kal-El number 10, where John comes out to her. He's so nervous about coming out to her, but her response is, "I love every single part of you." Sorry, I just love Lois. I mentioned earlier how happy I was that John Kent was getting his own issue in this event, but then in the actual story, it's starting to make me a little nervous. Because early on in the story, we see a moment where Clark Kent's Superman is depowered and then shot. And because he's depowered, bullets actually affect him now. Luckily, John was close by. He saved him. The next time we see John, he is getting his powers drained. He's been kidnapped, and he wakes up with no memory of even who he is. The next time we see Clark, we see him in the black suit, which they refer to as the recovery suit, which is very important, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So to recap, we have Lex Luthor being a completely new person, basically. He's even starting to adopt a little bit of a different look. We have Superman almost dying and having to wear his recovery suit. Clark is probably going to be fine. John is probably fucked. And Lois, as always, is a badass. But what really got me was how one of the issues ended. It ended in a pretty familiar way. If this doesn't look familiar to you, let's go back in time to shortly before I was born. In 92, 93, DC was publishing what would become one of the most influential stories in all of comics. And they started this storyline off by teasing it. And the way that they did this was by putting this page at the end of several Superman comics. Like it would be in one Superman comic, and then it would be in Action Comics, and then it would be in the next Superman comic, and the next Action Comics. This was how they teased the death of Superman. Like something big was coming, and they made sure you knew it. And this is obviously a recreation of that. Now, in The Death of Superman, one of the biggest parts of the story, one of the most memorable parts of the story, was they gave Superman a new look. And that was a black suit. That was how Superman was revived, was from this suit. Kind of an oversimplification. Another interesting part of this story, one of the cheesier aspects, Lex Luthor is dying. And so he cloned himself, but a younger version of himself that was like more healthy, younger, more athletic, though he looked completely different. So this was a clone of Lex Luthor with Lex Luthor's brain transplanted in, and he called himself Lex Luthor II, or Lex Luthor II. Kind of interesting that right around the time we get multiple references and teases that allude to the death of Superman, we're also getting a new look for Lex Luthor at the same time. Now, this event isn't just about the Super family. Like, that reading list is pretty diverse as far as, like, which characters they're actively choosing to involve. I know a lot of people tend to feel worn out on Superman stories because Superman is always at the forefront of DC. So I just wanted to make a point to say that I am coming at this from the perspective of a Superman fan. If you're not a fan of Superman, there's not that much of him realistically. But reading Absolute Power, I've started to feel something that I haven't felt in a while, and that is genuine excitement for the future of these characters. Now, it could turn out that I have just misplaced my faith. I feel like something big is coming. But yeah, obviously they're teasing it in pretty obvious ways, but a lot of times when comic companies like Marvel or DC say something big is coming, that something big ends up not being that big of a deal in the long run. Like, they will advertise certain things as like being the new death of Superman, and then it will turn out being kind of a nothing sandwich. But here, it actually does feel like it's going to be a big deal. It does feel like whatever they have planned, which apparently will follow up on in the fall, it feels like it actually is going to be a big deal. It feels like they're actually changing the status quo, but in a way that they're actually going to keep, that they're not going to like retcon immediately. Because if there's one thing that everyone knows about comics, the status quo never stays changed. Anytime something different happens to disrupt that status quo, it is pretty quickly retconned and we go back to how things were. And it just doesn't feel like that right now. Like, you've even got these cool character development moments with Mercy, where she's crying in Superman's arms, and that is so far off from what Mercy normally is. We're just gonna have to wait and see how everything pans out. But I do have one prediction, and this is something that I've been paranoid that DC is gonna do for a while, because John Kent's my favorite character. So it could just be paranoia, but I feel like one of two things is going to happen. Both of them pretty much amount to this being the death of Superman, but for John Kent, because I feel like they've made it pretty clear that Clark is going to be fine. And I really don't think that they would risk disrupting sales by like deleting Clark Kent. And I feel like he is going to be brought back as like the official Superman Blue, either of the main universe or this new Absolute universe. Regardless, it feels good to be able to say this again. I'm so excited by what DC is doing, and it's really refreshing seeing actually good writing. I don't know what the general consensus is among comic fans. I tend to not really interact with the comic fandom, so I just read the content now for the most part, so I don't know what other people think of Absolute Power, but what I think of it as a huge Superman fan, I think it's a great story so far. I'm just so nervous, and this feels like a big deal.